For most people, silence is an absence, a void waiting to be filled. But for Arthur, silence was a language. It was the native tongue of his world, a rich landscape where the smallest details spoke volumes. He didn't hear the world, he saw it, with a clarity the hearing often mistake for emptiness. In the quiet of his apartment, the universe wasn't muted, it was amplified. The dance of dust motes in a sunbeam, the shift in a neighbor's curtain, the rhythm of a spider's web. These were his symphony, a complex composition that told a story, and he was its most devoted listener. His window was a stage, and the star was Mrs. Eleanor, the woman in the apartment directly across the courtyard. For 7 years, their lives had run on parallel, silent tracks. Every morning at precisely 7:15, her lights would flicker on. At 7:30, she would appear with her blue ceramic watering can, tending to the small garden on her windowsill. At 8 o'clock, she'd settle into her armchair with a newspaper and tea, the steam a fleeting ghost against the glass. Arthur didn't need a clock, he had Mrs. Eleanor. Her routine was a metronome, a steady, comforting beat in the city's otherwise chaotic rhythm. He knew things about her that her own family might not. He knew she favored the chipped porcelain mug on rainy days and talked to her plants as she watered them, her lips forming silent, gentle words. He knew the slight tremor in her hand was worse in the winter, and that she always paused on the crossword's third clue, tapping her pen against her chin. Theirs was a friendship forged in observation, an intimacy without a single word ever exchanged. He was the silent guardian of her daily rituals, the sole audience to the quiet play of her life. She was his constant, an anchor in the storm. But this morning something was wrong. It wasn't a loud, crashing error. It was a whisper. A single note played flat. The red geranium. For over 2,500 consecutive days, the red geranium had occupied the far left corner of her windowsill. It was the first to receive water, the one she would prune before all others. It was a fixed point in his visual universe, as reliable as the sunrise. Today, however, it was on the right. The purple petunia was in its place. A simple swap, meaningless to any other observer. To Arthur, it was a profound violation. He leaned closer, his mind racing for a logical explanation. Perhaps she was rotating them for better sunlight. Perhaps she simply felt like a change. But the thought felt flimsy, a poor excuse for such a fundamental breach of protocol. Mrs. Eleanor was not a woman of whims. She was a creature of habit, of deep, unshakable patterns. This single, misplaced flower pot was more than just a change in decor. It was a character speaking out of turn, a sentence with the wrong punctuation. The comforting rhythm of his morning was gone, replaced by a low, humming frequency of unease. A silent alarm had been tripped, and only he could see it. The displaced geraniums were a discordant note in a silent symphony he had memorized. Arthur tried to dismiss it, a simple lapse in an old woman's routine. Perhaps she'd had a dizzy spell, or simply decided the flowers needed different sunlight. He reasoned with himself, his mind seeking the comfort of logic over the unease prickling his senses. For years, that window was his anchor, a predictable rhythm in the quiet of his life. A single change was insignificant, an anomaly. Yet, his eyes remained fixed on the glass, scanning for reassurance that this was a fleeting disruption. Then he saw the second sign, the curtain. A cream-colored lace curtain Eleanor always pulled back with a loose, fabric tie. Today it was different. The fabric was gathered tightly, cinched by a knot he had never seen. It wasn't a loop or bow. It was complex, a series of twists that looked deliberate, like a sailor's knot, functional, strong, and utterly out of place in her cozy world. A misplaced pot could be an accident. A knot, however, is an action. It requires intent. This was not a mistake. It felt like a symbol placed in the window for someone to read. The two anomalies shattered his forced calm. The geraniums and the knot were 2 points suggesting a deviation from the baseline, a corruption of the code he relied on. His heart began a frantic, silent rhythm. This was no longer about a break in routine, it felt like a message sent under duress. The knot wasn't decorative, it was tense, pulling the fabric tight. Was it a signal? A desperate, silent plea from one quiet world to another? He could no longer be a passive observer. The unspoken pact of neighborly vigilance demanded he cross the lawn that separated their quiet lives. He walked to her door, his steps feeling loud in his mind, and knocked. The vibration traveled up his arm. The door opened, but it wasn't Eleanor's familiar face. A man, perhaps in his late 40s, stood there. He was handsome, with slicked back hair and a professionally applied smile. "Can I help you?" His lips formed, the expression too bright, too rehearsed. He introduced himself as Mark, Eleanor's nephew, here to stay for a while to take care of things. His charm was a tangible force, a polished veneer designed to deflect and disarm. Arthur, taken aback, raised his hands to sign, but remembered Mark wouldn't understand. He resorted to pantomime, pointing to his window and then to hers, gesturing about the flower pot, about the strange knot. Mark's smile didn't falter. He placed a firm, patronizing hand on Arthur's shoulder, shaking his head with practiced sympathy. His lips moved slowly, condescendingly. "She's fine. Just tired. We're just changing things up." He gave a final, dismissive pat and gently but decisively closed the door, leaving Arthur on the porch, his unheard warning dissolving into the silent air. The door clicked shut, a sound he felt more than heard, sealing the mystery inside. The knotted curtain was not an anomaly, it was a prelude. After the nephew's dismissive visit, Arthur's focus sharpened. The following Tuesday, another signal appeared. The small bird feeder, a permanent fixture, was moved 6 inches to the left. To anyone else, an insignificant detail. But in Eleanor's world of meticulous, unchanging order, it was a seismic event. This was the moment the incidents coalesced into a pattern. A weekly ritual. A silent appointment held between 2 windows, a conversation where only one person was speaking, and the other was just beginning to learn the words. The language evolved, growing more specific, almost bizarre. One week, the ceramic garden gnome by her roses was turned exactly 180 degrees to face the back fence. The next, a specific book appeared in the windowsill, a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, propped with its spine facing outward. These were not the forgetful whims of old age. They were calculated placements, each object a single, cryptic sim. Bowl in a sentence he couldn't yet comprehend. It was a vocabulary of the mundane, repurposed into a secret dialect of desperation. This realization shifted something profound in Arthur. He was no longer a worried observer, he became a chronicler. Retrieving an old ledger, he began documenting everything. Date, time, a detailed description, and its exact position. He sketched the curtain knot from memory, noted the gnome's rotation, and wrote down the book's title and its unusual orientation. His quiet observation transformed into an active investigation. The window across the way was no longer a simple view, it was a page of text, written in a code he was now certain was meant for him alone. As his ledger filled, a dormant memory sparked to life. A neighborhood block party years ago, a fragment of an overheard conversation. Eleanor, then spry and lucid, talking animatedly to his mother. She spoke with a brilliant sparkle in her eye about her youth, working as a library clerk during the war. She didn't talk about sorting books, but the intricate games they played to pass the tense hours, creating ciphers, embedding messages in classifieds and solving puzzles for sport. It was a forgotten detail, a piece of trivia that now felt like a Rosetta Stone. It clicked into place with the force of a revelation. This wasn't a desperate, random cry for help. It was an intricately designed one. Eleanor wasn't just leaving clues, she was composing a message, using the objects of her constrained world as an alphabet. Her lifelong love for puzzles and ciphers hadn't faded with age. It had been honed into a tool for survival. Arthur looked from his growing list of anomalies to her silent window, a chilling understanding dawning. She wasn't just trapped. She was speaking in the only language she had left, praying that someone was not only watching, but was intelligent enough to read. The certainty had now solidified into a cold, heavy stone in his gut. Observation was no longer enough. Documentation was no longer enough. Action was required. With hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from a potent mix of fear and adrenaline, Arthur sat at his small kitchen table. He uncapped a fountain pen, the scratch of the nib on the thick paper the only sound he could imagine. He chose his words with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. He couldn't afford to sound like a rambling old man. He wrote of the patterns, the specific knots, the gnome, the book titles, a logical, chronological account of a silent conversation he was not meant to overhear. He folded the note, the crisp paper a declaration of war against the suffocating charm that emanated from the house across the street. His first target was the source of the charm itself, Eleanor's nephew. Arthur waited, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, until he saw him leaving the house. He intercepted him on the sidewalk, holding out the note as a shield. The nephew's smile, a practiced and polished thing, didn't falter. He took the paper, his eyes scanning the words with a theatrical air of concern. Then he looked at Arthur, his expression shifting to one of profound, pitying condescension. He folded the note carefully, tucked it into his pocket, and placed a firm, patronizing hand on Arthur's shoulder. He spoke slowly, over-enunciating words Arthur couldn't hear but could easily read on his lips. "Thank you for your concern, Arthur. You're a good neighbor. But you must be mistaken. Aunt Eleanor is just fine." The dismissal was absolute, using Arthur's own silence as a weapon against him. Undeterred, Arthur knew he needed a different approach. A professional. A few days later, a home care nurse arrived for her weekly visit. This was his chance for a credible witness. He approached her as she was leaving, offering a nearly identical, carefully worded note. She read it with a detached, clinical patience, her brow furrowed not with alarm, but with a kind of weary sympathy. She handed the note back to him, her voice, he imagined, a soft, placating murmur. Her expression said it all. "Sir, your neighbor is receiving the best possible care. She's an elderly woman, sometimes they get confused. Perhaps you're feeling a bit lonely?" He wasn't a witness, he was a symptom. A lonely, deaf old man, projecting his own anxieties onto a perfectly normal situation. He was dismissed again, this time not with malice, but with the sterile indifference of the healthcare system. The consequences of his failed attempts were immediate and chilling. He had not raised an alarm, he had merely alerted the jailer. The very next day, new heavy blackout curtains were installed in Eleanor's window, thick fabric that swallowed the light and any possibility of a signal. The small garden, once a stage for their bizarre theater, was tidied. The gnomes vanished. The bird bath was moved. Every object that had been used as a letter in their silent alphabet was systematically removed or obscured. The nephew was not just ignoring the messages. He was actively erasing the language itself, severing the one fragile connection Arthur had to the woman trapped inside. The silence from across the street was now total, enforced. Arthur stood at his window, staring at the newly impenetrable facade of Eleanor's home. His attempts to bring in the outside world had failed spectacularly. In fact, they had made things worse, strengthening the walls of her prison and reinforcing his own isolation. He was no longer just an observer. His actions had made him a participant, and a clumsy one at that. The world had told him twice that his eyes were lying, that his instincts were the ramblings of a man disconnected from reality. But he knew what he had seen. The condescending smiles and professional dismissals did not sow doubt. They fertilized a grim and stubborn resolve. If no one would listen, if no one would see, then he would have to unravel this himself. The burden was now his and his alone. The dismissal had settled into a cold, heavy silence. Days bled into one another, each a gray copy of the last. Arthur's notebook lay closed, its pages filled with a language no one else would read. The signals from across the way had stopped. Eleanor's window remained a blank, curtained eye, offering no more secrets. The nephew's victory felt absolute, a suffocating blanket of control. He had become what they saw him as, a confused old man inventing patterns where there were none. The despair was a quiet, constant companion, whispering that he had failed her. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. It was an ordinary morning, overcast and damp. He was making tea, his movements slow, his gaze drifting toward the window out of sheer habit. He almost looked away, expecting the same sterile emptiness. But something was wrong. A slash of color, violent and alien against the building's pale brick facade. It wasn't the muted green of a gnome or the soft cream of a book page. It was a searing, impossible red, a wound on the landscape of his view, fluttering frantically in the breeze as if trying to escape. He grabbed his binoculars, his hands trembling as he focused the lenses. It was a scarf. A long woolen scarf, tied in a crude knot around the black iron of her balcony railing. He knew it instantly. The scarlet scarf her sister had given her a decade ago. He remembered her holding it with theatrical disgust, calling the color a crime against subtlety. Eleanor, a woman of muted earth tones and elegant navies, loathed the color red with a passion. She had banished it to the bottom of a chest, never to be seen again. Its appearance was not an accident. It was a declaration. The memory surfaced with the force of a tidal wave, pulling him back to a rainy Sunday afternoon. They were sharing tea, a tattered spy novel open between them. He recalled her tracing a line of text describing a desperate agent's emergency signal, a personal item placed where it should never be. She had looked at him over her teacup, her eyes twinkling. If I were ever in real no-way-out trouble, she'd mused, I'd do that. No more clever codes. I'd use something everyone knows I despise. Something impossible. Like that ghastly scarlet scarf. My final flare. The warmth of the memory was extinguished by a chilling realization. This was not a game. It wasn't a test of his wits. The gnomes and books were a complex dialogue, a shared secret language. But this was different. The scarf was a monosyllabic scream. It was the abandonment of all subtlety for a single desperate message he alone was meant to understand. The condescending pity from the nurse and the nephew's smug dismissal evaporated. All that remained was the frantic whipping of the red fabric and the horrifying, unambiguous meaning behind it. This was the impossible signal. This was her final flare. The red silk was a declaration of war. For Arthur, every other option had evaporated, burned away by condescending smiles and dismissive notes. There was only one path left, a scorched earth tactic he desperately avoided. His hands trembled as he dialed the emergency number, the digits feeling alien. This wasn't just a call for help, it was a public escalation that would forever alter the quiet ecosystem of their building. He was inviting chaos into their private conflict, betting everything that a uniform could see through a deception that had fooled everyone else. He was no longer just a watcher. He was an actor, and this was his final, desperate scene. The flashing lights, silent to him but painting his walls in strobing blues and reds, felt like validation. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. The cavalry had arrived. He watched from his window as two officers approached Eleanor's door, their expressions a mixture of duty and routine. This was it. The truth would be exposed by the impartial hand of the law. The nephew's carefully constructed facade would crumble under official questioning. Arthur imagined them finding Eleanor, frail but resolute, confirming his fears and ending the quiet nightmare next door. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. The man who opened the door was not a cornered villain. He was the picture of concerned patience, smiling wearily at the officers. Arthur could almost read his lips from across the way as the practiced performance unfolded. He spoke of his poor, confused aunt, and the lonely, unstable neighbor who had developed a fixation. He used words like dementia and obsession, masterfully painting Arthur's concern as a symptom of his own sad decline. The officers' postures softened. They nodded, and the nephew, with an air of complete transparency, gestured them inside, sealing the narrative before Arthur could even present his own. The wait was an eternity. When the officers re-emerged, their faces were set with professional resolve. They walked to Arthur's door and his hopes sank. They were polite, but their tone was firm. They had spoken with Eleanor. She was fine, they said, tired but perfectly safe. The nephew had been nothing but cooperative. Frantically, Arthur pointed toward the balcony, his hands shaping the words, the scarf, the red scarf. One officer glanced up, his expression blank, then looked back at Arthur with pity. The railing was bare. The crimson flag of distress was gone, vanished as if it were a figment of his imagination. The final blow came as a quiet, official warning. They cautioned him about misusing emergency services. They spoke of harassment, advising him to leave his neighbors alone. In 10 minutes, he had been transformed from a vigilant protector into a public nuisance. His credibility was not just questioned, it was obliterated. As the police car pulled away, its silent lights disappearing, a more profound silence descended. He was now the crazy old man on record. He had played his final card and lost, leaving Eleanor more deeply imprisoned, her only rescuer now officially and irrevocably neutralized. The days that followed were defined by a profound and unnerving silence. The police warning had not just discredited Arthur, it had severed his last connection to the house across the street. The next morning he saw the final, unambiguous signal of defeat. Every single curtain in Eleanor's house was drawn shut. Not just the living room but the upstairs bedrooms, the small kitchen window, all of it. It was a fortress, a tomb. The house, which had once been a source of quiet life and subtle messages, had gone dark. It was a deliberate act of concealment, a final turning away. For Arthur, each closed curtain was a nail in the coffin of his hope, a silent, fabric-based declaration that the conversation was over, and he had lost. He fell into a hollow routine, his vigil now stripped of purpose. The binoculars felt heavy and useless in his hands. He was no longer looking for clues, but staring at a monument to his own failure. The neighborhood's subtle shifts were palpable. Glances from other residents were no longer curious, but wary, tinged with pity or annoyance. He was the crazy old man, the obsessive neighbor who had harassed a family dealing with an elderly relative. The nephew's narrative had won. Arthur replayed the scene with the police over and over, the man's smooth, practiced concern, the officer's dismissive expressions. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been publicly and comprehensively humiliated, his genuine fear twisted into a pathetic delusion. Then, a week after the curtains were drawn, the ultimate blow fell. A pristine sedan pulled into the driveway, and a man in a sharp suit emerged, carrying a wooden post and a large red and white sign. Arthur watched, frozen, as the man strode onto the lawn with practiced efficiency. The rhythmic, percussive thud of the mallet driving the stake into the earth echoed down the quiet street, each strike a punctuation mark on his failure. When the man stepped back, the sign was stark and brutal against the green grass. For sale. It was over. Whatever was happening or had happened was now being erased, packaged, and sold to the highest bidder. The house wasn't just silent, it was being liquidated. That sign broke something inside him. The obsession, the frantic search for meaning, all of it curdled into a thick, heavy resignation. He had failed her. He had seen the signals, he had understood the danger, but he had been powerless to stop it. The system had protected the predator, not the victim. For 2 days he didn't even look out the window. He began to gather his notes, the charts of her routines, the scribbled theories about the codes, and prepared to put them in a box. It was time to let go, to accept the crushing reality that he was too late. As dusk began to settle on the third day, he walked to his window for one last look, a final, painful goodbye to the woman he had tried to save. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't a signal, not a color or a misplaced object. It was a trick of the light. The setting sun, now low and golden, was hitting her upstairs window at a precise, acute angle. For a split second, a faint, web-like pattern shimmered on the glass. He almost dismissed it as a smudge or a reflection, but it held its shape. His heart suddenly hammering against his ribs, he snatched the binoculars one last time. He focused, his hands trembling. It wasn't a reflection. They were scratches. A series of fine, deliberate lines and dashes, etched into the inside of the pane, almost invisible. A message left in the one place no one would ever clean, visible only in the dying light of a defeated day. The final puzzle had just appeared. With his credibility shattered and every official door slammed shut in his face, Arthur's world contracted to a single point of light, the faint, almost spectral etching on Eleanor's window. The for sale sign was a monument to his failure, but the glass held a final, whispered secret. He retrieved his long-lens camera, the very instrument that had condemned him, and transformed it into a tool of forensic analysis. For 2 days he became a statue, waiting for the precise angle of the setting sun, that magical 5-minute window when the dying light would catch the imperfections in the glass and reveal the message he knew was there. He wasn't just taking a picture, he was capturing the last syllable of a dying sentence, a faint cry for help imprinted on the very barrier that separated her from the world. He retreated into the dim light of his apartment, the outside world ceasing to exist. On his monitor, the scratches became a chaotic alien landscape. He enlarged the image until the pixels were the size of bricks, tracing each jagged line with his cursor, his mind racing to find a pattern in the noise. It was maddening. The lines intersected without logic, a meaningless web of damage. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep in. The nephew's mocking voice, the police officer's dismissive glare, they echoed in the silence of the room. Was this it? The final, definitive proof of his own unraveling? Was he projecting meaning onto a random act of decay, desperately trying to justify an obsession that had cost him everything? The shift came not from a sudden insight, but from a slow, creeping memory. He thought of Eleanor not as a victim, but as the woman who tended her roses with painstaking care. He remembered her mentioning her late husband, a man who loved the stars, and the old brass telescope she kept polished in the study. The cosmos. That was her language of love, of memory. He looked back at the screen and the chaotic lines were no longer just scratches. They were vectors, pathways, connections. His mind, so attuned to finding patterns in human behavior, began to search for a different kind of order. It's in these moments of profound focus that a puzzle begins to yield its secrets. If you believe Arthur is on the verge of a breakthrough, hit that like button and tell us in the comments what celestial message you think Eleanor could have left behind. Armed with this new hypothesis, he opened a new window on his computer. Digital star charts, astronomical databases, ancient celestial maps. He began the painstaking work of overlaying his photograph of the scratches onto the constellations. He rotated the image, flipped it, scaled it, comparing it to chart after chart. For hours, nothing. Then a flicker of recognition. He aligned the image with a chart of the winter sky, and the chaotic lines snapped into place. It was unmistakable. The constellation Lyra. But it was altered. Most of the main stars were connected by faint lines, but one, the brilliant star Vega, was gouged into the glass, circled by a deep, desperate scratch. It wasn't just a map, it was a destination. In that instant, Arthur understood. His obsession, his curse, had been his salvation all along. His relentless observation, his cataloging of every minute detail of Eleanor's life, was not the symptom of a troubled mind, but a unique form of perception. He saw the world in patterns others missed. The police saw a potential stalker, the nephew saw a meddling old fool. But Eleanor, in her final moments, must have realized the truth. She knew he was watching. She knew only his peculiar, unwavering gaze would ever be sharp enough to notice a message written in starlight on a pane of glass. The scratches were not a cry for help to the world. They were a private message, a final puzzle, left for the one man she knew would be looking. The celestial map was a lock, but every key Arthur tried failed to turn. For weeks, he lived by the rhythm of the stars, cross-referencing the pattern against astronomical charts. He adjusted for every conceivable variable, yet it was always wrong. The constellation he recognized as a warped Cygnus was stretched too far. The angles were off by critical degrees. It was like a familiar song played in the wrong key, unsettling, fundamentally broken. The frustration mounted into silent dread. Eleanor's clear message was, it seemed, a beautiful and ultimately useless puzzle. The breakthrough came not from looking up but down. In a moment of exhaustion, he minimized the star charting software, revealing a cached map of the city. As he moved the window, a faint overlay of the star map lingered for a second, and in that ghost image, everything realigned. The distorted lines didn't belong to the cosmos. They traced the curves of the old riverfront and the grid of the industrial district. The celestial distortion wasn't a mistake, it was a projection. Eleanor wasn't pointing to the heavens. She was using the language of stars to map home. With this new lens, the code surrendered its secrets. Arthur unearthed archaic city maps from online archives, documents from before highways bisected neighborhoods. The work was terrestrial archaeology. The three bright stars of Orion's belt align. D with three long demolished fountains along what was once Hunter's Way. The brilliant star Rigel corresponded to the old Starlight Cinema, a place existing only in faded photographs. Each star was an anchor driven into a forgotten version of the city, a landscape that existed only in Eleanor's memory. The puzzle wasn't just spatial but temporal. He traced the lines on the brittle maps, a secret cartography leading to one focal point. The North Star, Polaris, the celestial anchor, didn't point to a grand monument. It landed on something mundane, almost invisible on the sprawling chart, a tiny intersection in a neglected part of town. The corner of Compass Street and Weaver's Lane. It was an address. All the astronomical complexity, the layers of misdirection, had been an elaborate method for writing down one location. A place so important it had to be protected by a key of starlight. Triumph washed over him, but receded into a cold tide of apprehension. The destination was clear, but the purpose remained murky. Why create such an elaborate cipher for a simple address? This wasn't sharing a fond memory, it was burying a secret. The complexity of the lock was a warning, implying what it protected was either immensely valuable or dangerous. He was being led, but was it by Eleanor's guiding hand or into a trap she feared? The map was no longer a clue, it was a choice, a destination promising either revelation or ruin. The address led not to a workshop, but to something grander and more desolate. The city's old Athenaeum, a monument of granite, now silent and condemned. This was Eleanor's first job, a place she spoke of with a mix of fondness and sorrow. The star map wasn't a clue, it was a memory. But as Arthur stood before it, the feeling was not nostalgia but dread. One of the heavy doors was ajar, a dark invitation. He pushed it open, the groan of hinges echoing in the stillness. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying the scent of decaying paper and something watchful. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the cavernous dark. Moonlight struggled through boarded-up windows, illuminating columns of dust. Towering shelves stretched into the shadows like the ribs of a leviathan. In the center of the main reading room sat a single desk, remarkably clear of the surrounding debris. It drew him forward. As his fingers grazed the dusty wood, a floorboard creaked on the mezzanine above. It wasn't the sound of a settling building. It was deliberate, measured. Arthur froze, every nerve screaming. This wasn't a sanctuary of memories. It was a staged ambush. The nephew. He had been waiting. The silent hunt began. No threats, no rushed movements, only the suffocating tension of two minds in a spatial battle. Arthur melted into the aisles, the labyrinth of knowledge his only shield. Above, he heard the soft, methodical footsteps of his pursuer, a patient predator scanning the maze below. This wasn't a chase, it was a geometric problem, a deadly game of angles and sightlines. Arthur's mind began to work, not just hiding but mapping. He visualized the library's layout, the intersections, the dead ends, and the few precious paths to escape. His heightened awareness became his weapon. He didn't just see the library, he felt its structure. He sensed the variations in airflow that betrayed a passage, the way sound dampened near densely packed books. He moved with a purpose born of pure calculation. A pushed stack of encyclopedias tumbled to the floor 2 aisles over, a perfect auditory misdirection. As the footsteps above shifted toward the sound, Arthur slipped away in the opposite direction. He was turning the nephew's high vantage point against him. The library was no longer just a building, it was an extension of his mind, a system he could manipulate. He saw his chance, a tall window at the far end of the hall, its glass shattered, leading to a fire escape. But between him and freedom lay a terrifyingly open stretch of the main reading room. He needed a bigger diversion. Spotting a massive, freestanding bookshelf listing precariously, he found his solution. He wedged a fallen timber beneath it and heaved. The colossal structure teetered and crashed down with a deafening roar. In that singular moment of chaos, while his hunter was disoriented, Arthur sprinted. He flew across the floor, vaulted a broken table, and scrambled through the window frame, the cold night air a shocking, welcome salvation. Bursting through a side exit, the night air was a shock to his lungs, cold and sharp after the library's stagnant dust. Arthur stumbled into a narrow alley, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every shadow seemed to twist into the nephew's lean silhouette. He was exposed, a target under the sickly orange glow of a single street lamp. The silence inside had been a suffocating blanket, but this quiet was different. It was a watchful, predatory stillness. He pressed himself against the cold brick, certain that footsteps would soon echo from the darkness. The escape wasn't an ending, merely a transition to a larger cage. A movement made him flinch. A figure stood half hidden by a dumpster at the alley's mouth. It wasn't the nephew. It was a young woman, her face pale in the dim light, clutching a small camera. Her eyes were wide, not with aggression, but with startled curiosity. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice barely cutting through the city's hum. Arthur stared, his mind racing. Was she with them? A lookout? Another part of the trap? He tensed, ready to bolt, but her posture wasn't threatening. It was hesitant, almost concerned, a disorienting note in the symphony of his paranoia. "I saw him go in," she said, taking a cautious step. "The man in the suit. About 20 minutes before you." She gestured with her camera. "I'm documenting this place for the Historical Society. They want to tear it down." Her explanation tumbled out in a nervous rush. "I was filming the facade when he arrived. He didn't see me." He moved like he owned the place, but also like he was hunting something. She looked from the camera back to Arthur's ragged state. Or someone. Her words hung in the air, a fragile bridge of truth across the chasm of his solitary nightmare. Doubt warred with a need to believe. He watched as she fumbled with her camera, turning the small screen towards him. And there it was. Grainy, low-light footage, but undeniably clear. The nephew, his face a mask of cold purpose, striding to the library's entrance and disappearing inside. The timestamp in the corner confirmed her story. It was real. Tangible proof. 4 weeks, Arthur had been adrift in a sea of uncertainty, his reality questioned by everyone, including himself. Seeing that image, that moment captured by a stranger, was like a first breath after being held underwater. The validation was a physical jolt. "He was hunting you," she stated, not a question. The terror in his eyes was her answer. For the first time, Arthur faced not a skeptic, but an ally. "I'm Maya," she said. "I don't know what's happening, but that man is dangerous, and this building is at the center of it." Arthur finally found his voice, a ragged whisper. "Eleanor." The name was a key, and he saw it unlock recognition in her eyes. A connection was forged. He had a piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve, and she held what he desperately needed, proof. In that grimy alley, a pact was formed. He was no longer alone. With the immediate threat neutralized, a new and fragile alliance settled in the dusty silence of the library. The activist, armed with a digital camera and a deep-seated distrust for the city's powerful, saw in Arthur not a madman, but a victim of the same corruption she fought to expose. Her footage of the nephew was their only leverage, a single thread of truth in a web of lies. For Arthur, her belief was a lifeline. They agreed to work together, not in the shadows of escape, but in the dim light of investigation. The very building that was meant to be his tomb now became their headquarters, its forgotten knowledge their only weapon. Her familiarity with the building was their guide. She led him down to the municipal archives, a cavernous basement forgotten by time, where the city's paper soul lay entombed in crumbling cardboard boxes. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and neglect. 4 hours they worked under the stark beam of a single flashlight, their search methodical and desperate. They sifted through brittle birth certificates, faded property deeds, and decades of employment records, looking for any mention of Eleanor or her family that deviated from the mundane. It was a painstaking process, each dead end a small defeat, each turn of a page a silent prayer for a clue. The discovery came not from a file marked Eleanor, but from one labeled with her father's name, Alastair Finch. Arthur had known him only as a quiet, unassuming man who passed away years ago. But the city records told a different story. Alastair Finch was no simple citizen. He was a horologist, a master clockmaker of considerable local fame. His signature was on the blueprints for the city's most iconic public clocks. Suddenly, Eleanor's world tilted on its axis. Her meticulous nature, her obsession with patterns and timing, it wasn't just a personality trait. It was a legacy, a language passed down from father to daughter. This revelation was the key that unlocked the first clue. They raced back upstairs to the grimy window pane, the faint starlight now illuminating the scratches with new meaning. Arthur traced the lines with his finger, the constellations he had memorized. But his new ally saw something else. With her eye for design and structure, she recognized the geometry not of the heavens, but of a machine. The lines weren't just connecting stars. They were depicting levers, gears, and escapement wheels. It was a dual-purpose schematic, a celestial map overlaid perfectly onto the intricate guts of a clockwork mechanism. The final connection was almost instantaneous. They cross-referenced the unique geared train etched on the glass with the archived blueprints of Alastair Finch's work. The search yielded a single, undeniable match: the grand astronomical clock in the old public tower, a landmark that had chimed over the city for half a century. The window didn't just show a view of the tower, it held its very heart. The map of stars wasn't pointing to a distant galaxy, but to a precise location on Earth, a machine built by her father. The puzzle was no longer about why but where, and the answer was ticking just a few blocks away. The library's quiet revelation was shattered by a new urgency. They didn't speak, a shared understanding propelled them into the cold evening air. The city was a maze of hurried footsteps, but their destination was singular. The public clock tower, a Gothic spire piercing the twilight, grew larger with every frantic step. It wasn't just a building, it was a legacy, a final message from a grandfather. They knew the nephew's net was closing, that every tick of that distant clock was a second lost, a chance for their discovery to be buried forever alongside Arthur's reputation. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of decades and the metallic scent of oil. A spiral staircase, worn smooth by generations of keepers, wound its way into the darkness. Their only light came from Lena's phone, a modern beam cutting through ancient gloom, illuminating cobwebs that draped the massive counterweights like shrouds. As they ascended, a sound began to build, a low, rhythmic heartbeat. Thump thump. It was the sound of time itself, a mechanical pulse that grew stronger until it vibrated in their bones. Arthur closed his eyes, listening past the noise, searching for a frequency he hadn't heard since childhood. They emerged into the clock room, a cavern of interlocking brass and steel. Giant gears turned with deliberate power as the great pendulum swung in a mesmerizing arc. Here, Eleanor's star map finally made sense. It was a map of this mechanism. Arthur, guided by the memory of the etched glass, moved with startling certainty. He ran his fingers over the machinery, ignoring obvious levers, seeking something hidden. He found it on the main escapement wheel, a single tooth, subtly misshapen, engraved with a tiny star. "Every perfect machine," he whispered, "needs one imperfect piece. A signature." With a precise twist, a loud click echoed as a flush-mounted panel slid open. The compartment held a single object, a heavy oilskin-wrapped folio. Lena carefully untied the string, her hands trembling as she revealed the contents. It was all there: the original deeds, contracts with forged signatures, and meticulous financial records detailing a systematic campaign of fraud. It was the proof they needed, undeniable and absolute. But their triumph was brutally cut short. A shadow fell across the doorway, and a calm voice dripped with poison. "I knew you'd eventually figure it out. A shame you won't live to tell anyone." The nephew stood there, a cruel smile on his face, before the heavy oak door slammed shut with a deafening thud. The nephew lunged forward, but at that exact moment the hour struck. The chamber exploded into a maelstrom of sound. Massive hammers struck colossal bells, their peals a physical force. Gears the size of tables ground against each other with a deafening shriek as the entire floor vibrated violently. For the nephew, the sensory assault was paralyzing, a disorienting hell of noise and shadow. But for Arthur it was home. This was the language he understood. He could discern the pattern in the chaos, predict the movement of every lever and piston. Amidst the roaring heart of his grandfather's magnum opus, Arthur knew the nephew's time had just run out. The clock tower's cacophony surrendered to sirens. Defeated in a world of pure noise, the nephew offered no resistance. Arthur felt the vibration of justice as the police moved in. The overwhelming sound that had been his shield now receded, leaving a profound vacuum. It was the ringing silence that follows a storm, a quiet that felt louder than the chaos it replaced. The danger had passed, the city held its breath, and in that quiet, the true story could finally be told, not with spoken words, but with a language far more intimate. Below, Eleanor was guided into the night air, her eyes scanning the scene not with fear but resolve. They found Arthur as he descended. No grand embrace was exchanged. Instead, a simple nod passed between them, an acknowledgement transcending sound. The documents were with the authorities, and the nephew's empire of deceit, built on exploiting silence, had crumbled. For the first time in years, Eleanor's world was defined not by what she couldn't hear, but by the one person who had listened. Later, in a quiet waiting room, Eleanor spoke her language. She placed a smooth stone on the table. Then she took a paperclip, laying it beside the stone, its tip pointed towards Arthur. It wasn't random, it was a sentence. Her intense gaze communicated more than words ever could. She wasn't asking how he solved the puzzle of the objects. She was asking something far deeper, a question heavy with unspoken history. How did you know our language? Arthur met her gaze with a knowing smile. From his wallet, he slid a creased photograph across the table. It showed two children under an oak tree, a young Eleanor and a boy. My grandfather, Arthur signed, his hands moving with grace. Your best friend. He was deaf too. The truth settled in the room, rearranging the past. The language of objects was never just Eleanor's invention. It was their secret code, created by two children to navigate a hearing world, a silent pact passed down to him as a game. The silence connecting them was no longer absence, but reunion. A friendship spanning a century found its voice through a grandson fulfilling a role he never knew he had. The nephew's loud world was undone by the quietest whisper, a legacy preserved in stones and metal. It's a reminder that the most important messages are those never spoken aloud. The world is full of hidden languages waiting to be deciphered. To uncover more with us, subscribe and activate notifications, because our next investigation uncovers a secret hidden in plain sight.